Great.
All right, so we'll get to our forecast contest in a little bit, but since there was a lot of discussion on hurricane forecasts, or the seasonal Atlantic hurricane forecast last week, I wanted to check in on how things are going. Certainly the early part of the season was extremely active, but right now we're fairly inactive. There's only one little X, and it's only a 10% chance of something forming. So it is quiet. And the reason, the other thing that brought this to my mind is when I was going through my forecast process, which is always just look at the CPC forecast and turn it into a number. I saw in their discussion, they noted the MJO was in a state that might suppress Atlantic hurricane or tropical cyclogenesis over the next few weeks into early August. So this inactive period perhaps may persist for a while. Of course, the main season later into August and September, certainly we could kick things back up and get these huge numbers of storms, like it seems like everyone is forecasting this season. But I thought it was interesting if I went to, I also, so I just looked around at what's going on with our sea surface temperatures right now in the Atlantic. And there's actually somewhat large swath of slightly below normal temperatures, especially in the Gulf of Mexico right now, so the subtropical Atlantic. In contrast, it's warm along the equator. There's a bit of the so-called Atlantic Nino seems to be in place. And then also south of the equator in the south tropical Atlantic, it's above normal as opposed to 0 or thereabouts north. So this is a negative phase of something called the Atlantic meridional mode. So I looked up, where is it? Here's the graphic, at least as of May, this is lagged. I guess it takes a while for whatever data this is based on to come in. But at least in May, you see this pattern of cool north of the equator and warm south of the equator. That's the negative phase of the Atlantic meridional mode. And my understanding is when you have a negative phase, that tends to pull the ITCZ closer to the equator and inhibits at least our Cape Verde season for hurricane formation. However, I noticed last year at this, well, in May last year, it was also negative, although not as negative. So I don't know if you can see the little dot there for May 2020. It was about a -1, and yet we had record-breaking season. However, last year it was trending up, and this year it's just kind of nosedived into May. So I don't know if this will be a fly in the ointment to some of those forecasts. I'm not a hurricane seasonal forecaster, but I just noticed this sea surface temperature pattern going on right now, sort of May through now. This is the May plot. It doesn't look too different from the current plot. I don't know if anyone else on the call does more with subseasonal or seasonal forecasting of Atlantic tropical cyclone activity, but I just thought that was interesting. I don't remember anyone mentioning this last week as a possible fly in the ointment for all these forecasts for a very active season. Of course, May and June were very active despite this pattern, so clearly this isn't the only game in town, but I thought that was interesting to note. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add about the tropics before we move to our subseasonal forecast.
Yeah, this is Dave. I don't have anything to add, but I'm curious. Dave Darkangelo's on. Dave, do you have a view on that, or just are there any contrarian views in the market that you're aware of that aren't going for sort of a gangbusters year?
Hi, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Well, I'm back at the office. So I'm trying out some new technology here, and just want to make sure you can hear me. So I didn't hear the first part of that. I just jumped on a few minutes ago. So I heard Dr. Decker talking about the temperature profile in the Atlantic. But I think to answer your question, Dave, no, I'm not familiar with. I don't really know of anyone that's not going for an above normal or much above normal season. Right now, there's really everybody's seemingly keying in on a robust number season, and in the order of, I don't know, probably, well, I would say the middle 80% of the distribution is probably between like 14 and 20 storms. I'm just cuffing that, although that doesn't typically have a lot of meaning in the natural gas or crude oil markets. But nevertheless, one thing I will say, I don't know if it was covered by Dr. Decker earlier when he was speaking, but we're right now in a fairly suppressed phase of the Kelvin wave over Africa and the Western Indian Ocean. And that is really inhibiting wave development across the kind of central eastern Atlantic. The active phase of the the MJO cycle is kind of shifted more towards the Indonesian subcontinent and kind of maybe the far western, some bleeding into the far western Pacific. So for now, the Atlantic will stay quiet as long as we're in this suppressed phase over Africa. I don't see indications of when that will relent. Of course, we're very early in the season still, and we can see that flip in a month, and we're kind of, the lid goes off and it's kind of gangbusters. So this is just more of a, I think when I say subseasonal in tropics, I'm thinking people are thinking a couple, maybe 3 weeks out with maybe marginal confidence.
Right, and last year in September it did go gangbusters, which we participate in the forecast process for CSU's group, and yeah, 14 to 20 seems like where everybody was. And I'm almost looking for a repeat of last year, just based on the upper air patterns and maybe a return to a more favorable MJO later on. So yeah, it could go gangbusters like last September.
Mm-hmm. So that'll be something to watch as we head into the main part of the season for sure. All right, so let's take a look at what happens. I think it's this tab. Yes, so what happens with our most recent verification period? We had a forecast on June 22nd for the period July 7th through July 11th. This was right when Death Valley was hitting 130 degrees and all these records were falling out west. So surely our CDDs were way above normal and it was super hot everywhere. But if I go down to their verification, it's only 54.5, which is actually below, certainly below the 10-year, but even below the 30-year normal for this period. And that means everyone got negative skill scores because everyone was warmer than the 30-year normal by varying degrees. And basically, the warmer you were, the more negative your skill score was for this forecast. So how did this happen? How did we get record heat out west and yet below normal CDDs? So I have somewhere, I just have to find it with all of my tabs. I think this is it. Yeah, so here is the verification. Let me get my little videos here out of the way. So here's what actually happened. And indeed, it was super hot out west. However, aside from Las Vegas, there aren't a lot of people in this dark red area. Whereas Chicago is sitting in this fairly chilly spot, -6, I think is what it says there, as well as Texas, and really almost all of the eastern half of the country, aside from the mid-Atlantic, was all sitting below normal. And there's a lot more people in this area than there is in this area. And hence the overall CDDs ended up slightly below normal. So when I went and looked at some of the patterns, the forecast patterns, that's on my other, for our forecast. So I guess I'll work from the negative scores and then work our way up, but they all seem to be fairly consistent, right? So I click on this forecast map and I see, all right, it's normal around Texas and then heat everywhere else. Close that. Click on this one, it's the same. Click on this one. It does have normal around the Midwest, but again, heat everywhere else. So we have, everyone seemed to be forecasting roughly the same picture here. We have a little cool in the West, but otherwise, again, there's a lot more red than blue. No blue at all on any of these. Let's see if this loads. We do have the blue. Okay, so this one, we're starting to get even closer to what verified, right? So we have the below normal around Texas, but we're missing the cool in the Midwest. And that seemed to be the key. What went wrong in this forecast? Everyone pretty much had heat in the West and probably overdid the heat in the East, but it's really the Midwest, the Great Lakes area, that seems to have been the fly in the ointment with this particular forecast. See, we have another warm Midwest there. Normal Midwest there. I think I had a normal. Yeah, so everyone missed the cold Midwest as far as I can tell. So if I go back to what actually happened, and it was a pretty significant, this is pretty significant cold across the Midwest that seemed to be missed. So let's take a look at what do the models say for this period. We have some model plots that we can look at. CFS was way down here at the bottom, so let's look at theirs first. And so I was kind of surprised when I looked at this and yet saw that the CFS is way at the bottom of the list. We have a pretty cold area, including Chicago, and we have warmth in the west. But I guess there's just that cold bias in the summer. Might be if I added 5 degrees or 3 degrees to this entire pattern, maybe suddenly it becomes accurate. But so I was surprised how badly this scored, given this picture. I guess it's just not hot enough in the west, or maybe the cold in the east didn't quite spread far enough to the east compared to the verification. But maybe the cold in the southeast was missing. I'm not really sure how it scored so bad, because it doesn't look that bad looking at the map here. Maybe it's missing enough cold around Houston and the Gulf Coast. Not really sure, because certainly Dodge City, Kansas is not contributing a lot to the CDDs. In contrast, the ECMWF, which scored better, when I look at its map, it seems completely wrong. I mean, it has some heat here in the Northwest, but it's not getting Death Valley or Las Vegas. It is getting some of the Midwest too warm, and the cold just isn't there. So somehow this was a better score than the CFS, but it seems to me like the CFS actually had the pattern a bit better, especially the cold across the plains and Midwest. So I'm not sure exactly what went on. I didn't crunch the numbers myself, but this could have been, the ECMWF got a better score, but maybe for the wrong reasons, it seems like, based on at least these 2 meter temperature departures. I don't know if anyone else has some feedback on that while I pull up the 500 millibar heights to see what the large scale pattern was that led to these forecasts. And we can compare that to the actual 500 millibar height pattern. All right, so here's what the CFS had. We do have a ridge over the west, a ridge over, looks like New Brunswick, and then a little tiny little negative height anomaly centered over the Ozarks, and then a big negative height anomaly off the west coast. Let's compare that to what actually happened, which I think if I go over here and change to like global height anomalies, I think we can see this pretty quickly. How do we get rid of the ocean? I have to click this. Click it again. It seemed like there was a little bug. Yeah, okay, so there we go. For some reason, I have to click that twice, but the ocean disappears. And what do we have? We have what actually happened was a ridge over the west. There was a ridge. It was a little further east of New Brunswick, Canada, but there it is. A stronger negative height anomaly over the Midwest compared to the CFS forecast. And there's the low, so northeast of Hawaii. So again, looking at the CFS pattern, if I switch my display, to me, this seemed, the date doesn't quite correspond, but that's as close as I think I can come. It seemed pretty good to my eye, along with those 2 meter temperature departures, and yet the CFS was at the bottom of the table. There are differences as you head into the polar regions, but looking just around the CONUS area, it certainly didn't capture the full fury of the trough where that cool air was placed around Chicago. But otherwise, it seemed to be on the right track. So that was interesting, that the CFS could be so close. And this is, I don't think you can really ask for a better forecast at 16 to 20 days, and yet it's the worst forecast. ECMWF, what did it look like? I guess close that. So here's the map, and there's no sign of any negative height anomalies anywhere near the Midwest. The low off the Pacific coast is non-existent, or it's barely there. It just doesn't seem to be as close to what actually happened as the CFS forecast. And that also goes with the 2-meter temperature pattern. So we have, I don't know. It's odd to me that the CFS was so poor in its verification for this period, unless I'm looking at the wrong data somehow. But it seems like the key that neither model and no one, I guess, was forecasting was this trough over the Midwest, where we had all of that cool air, or relatively cool air for this time of the year, leading to those negative departures in cooling degree days. Any thoughts from anyone else on what transpired over this period?
Hi, Dr. Decker. This is Dave Darkangelo. Do you have I mean, I missed maybe the first few minutes of you talking about the forecast. I've been kind of taking a few other questions here, but have you shown, or did you have a depiction of precipitation anomalies, or just like overall precipitation through this period? Like clearly for Texas, precipitation's been well above normal, and I think parts of the southern and eastern Midwest. I'm not sure how much of a role that. I think it's played a substantial role, but I guess the map will tell the tale.
This is the departures from normal for the precip.
So that's that to me really aligns well with this anomaly. We're probably really I guess it's just something that the models handle poorly, and in my experience, we sometimes will underestimate how suppressed high temperatures can be, particularly in the south, when you have an active precipitation pattern. Obviously, it really was Texas, especially, and then that corridor from Nebraska to the Ohio Valley. Seemed like that was probably a fairly substantial player. I don't have a recall on. I also had a terrible forecast, so I'm not really the person to ask. But I don't have a really recall what the CFS or Europe depiction. I think the models have been depicting a cool Texas for quite some time in the subseasonal. A wet late spring has really kind of set the tone there, but I'm not so sure about the Midwest.
Yeah, for this particular forecast, the CFS didn't extend the cold all the way to the Gulf Coast, but the CFS did have a pretty substantial cold anomaly across the central US. And yet it scored really bad in the contest. I guess
you're missing.
I guess the Gulf Coast is the key, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't cold
you're
enough
missing.
Along the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, it didn't have the cold as much in places like Chicago, Atlanta,
right.
and Houston.
Yep.
As it ended up being. So the skill, but I would agree with you. I think I heard you make the statement when I jumped back on the call, which is it's kind of geographic depiction of where the anomaly was going to be was really quite strong. I agree with that, and it was a little bit mislead. I guess it generally but it just misaligned where the core of above normals were in the West. It ended up being more Vegas focused,
right,
in this scenario. Yeah, not that I agree. Not that matters much from a CDD perspective, but certainly this map really was the proper. Drawing a map like this is looks like a strong verification, but you're right. The numbers don't reflect that.
Well, and nobody forecast that our area, the Missouri, the central Missouri area and states adjacent to that, were going to get soaked in late June, and that's probably helping to keep temperatures down as well. We got over 10 inches of rain in a week, and a lot of places around us fared the same. So maybe that's what's driving the Midwest cool, but that warm northwest, cool southeast pattern has been remarkably persistent.
And sadly, we can't get any winter to look like that at all.
I'm just showing how wet it was in Missouri in late June, and it's continued into. It was also wet during the verification period here in July 7th to the 11th. So.
Oh yeah, we've been soaked.
Interestingly, I guess when you're 600%, but the climatology is like 0.01 inches probably. This green blob probably is not actually a lot of.
It was an early onset to the southwest
Okay.
The
southwest
monsoon.
monsoon. Yeah, by about a week or so. Yeah, week to 10 days. But yeah, you're right. Doesn't take much to get that like that to pop out there. And it normally is zero. Right?
So it seemed like the cold, the rain, the cold, the trough over the sort of Mississippi Valley, Great Lakes area seemed to be the missing ingredient in all of these forecasts, at least the amplitude of that. So I took a look at, let's see if I can find synoptically what was going on during the verification period. And yeah, so here is the 500 millibar map on July 8th. And if I step forward, we'll see there are all these little short waves kind of diving right through the middle of the ridge and then amplifying on the downstream side. And I guess as each of these short waves go through, they spark convection and precipitation and clouds and kept things cool across that region. And these short waves seem to originate, from the North Pacific somewhere. So to track this back a little bit further in time, I went to a CSU archive of 500 millibar maps for the old fax style. And so there's this trough, which again, the CFS had this feature and the ECMWF did not seem to have this feature off the West Coast. And it was kind of spitting out a few little short waves with this huge view. It's kind of smoothed out, but there you can see a little low coming along and making its way over the ridge into Washington State and then diving down the east side. And I think this happens a few times, helping to reinforce this trough over the Great Lakes. There's another very positively tilted shortwave coming down right into the Midwest. And finally it gets an L at the end of the verification period. Just series of shortwaves going over the ridge from the Pacific into the Midwest seem to be a key synoptic player. I also pulled up potential vorticity plots somewhere to get an animated view of this. This one. So this is a 350 Kelvin isentropic surface with PV contours. And we see over this period, which is basically our verification period, more or less, July 7th through the 12th. You can see our ridge, our big negative, our PV anomaly, and then all these little positive PV anomalies going around the ridge. There is something that dives down from Canada that seemed to go, come out of the Pacific and then dive down and just reinforce this area of positive PV anomalies, the ridge or the trough over the Mississippi Valley during this period that seemed to be absent from these forecasts. Even the CFS didn't fully capture that trough, that positive PV anomaly. There's also this interesting upper level feature heading towards Florida at this time over this period. And we do see that today in the 200 millibar map.
I think that's ELSA.
No, this is after ELSA. So if I go back to, we'll see ELSA at the beginning of this animation. Actually, we don't see it at this level. We see ELSA better at 330 Kelvin, but this is something that we see in the current 200 millibar map. It doesn't show up as any close contour, but you see the swirl and the little warm blob over South Carolina. So 200 millibars, we have a little bit of a warm anomaly with that circulation. We can see in the stratosphere a little bit there. So I don't know if there's any sensible weather associated with that swirl, but if anything, it's helping to contribute to the overall troughiness in the east, even now. And we see our ridge going nowhere in the west. So going forward, we have in the CPC, so I'm going to briefly discuss my forecast because it's just the CPC forecast. And then we'll open up for others' forecasts, as we usually do, but it's kind of a broken record. Warm in the northwest and along the northern tier, cold along the Gulf Coast. The probabilities are not as large as some of the past forecasts have been. The 70 contour, for instance, is gone. I think there have sometimes been 60s down along the Gulf Coast with the area of cool. But overall, it's the same pattern. And so my forecasts, I went slightly below normal, figuring there's more people in the blue than there is in the orange. But with an increased sigma value given, we have this implied gradient. And if the warmth spreads into Chicago, suddenly the CDDs will go way up. If the cold spreads up into St. Louis, they'll go down. So I've increased my sigma in my forecast. So if I go to the actual numbers here and switch to today, we'll see my number is 55.8, which is a little bit on the cool side. Maybe it's the coolest. Well, the CFS is even colder. Some persistence is a little colder, but otherwise it looks like I am just slightly on the colder side of all the other humans in the forecast. And we have certainly some forecasts very warm as well. So some disagreement there. That'll be interesting to discuss in a moment. The last thing I wanted to show was the MJO, because the CPC in their discussion, they noted the MJO was starting to, they said it was becoming more coherent. And I thought that was interesting, given that at least the GEFS phase diagram here shows a forecast in the circle of death until we get to the ends of the period, in which case, I mean, there's a lot of spread here, but perhaps as we head into our actual verification period, we might actually have something going on in phases 5 and 6. But right now we are sitting right around phase 2, 3 and the circle, somewhere in that area. So if I look at what the MJO analog indicates, I guess it's this one, both July 1 and August 1, right, with the 16 to 20 lag, we're looking at a minor anomaly, probably slightly warm because there is some orange around. And indeed, when we go to the forecast for the MJO analog, we do see it is slightly on the warm side of the long-term averages. No matter what average you look at, it is slightly warmer than that, consistent with those graphics. So with that, would someone else on the call like to discuss their forecast?
Yeah, sure, I'll jump on. So I've got sticking with my usual formula here with my Euro 10-year blend, which based on the last few verifications has not done that well, to say the least. But started off with a value of 61.26 based on those two numbers. Then I looked at the CPC, was a little bit more generous this week with lowering the CPC, or lowering my forecast based on the CPC due to the last couple of verifications. So I lowered my forecast 1.5 CDDs based on the CPC forecast of continued coolness in the southeast and a little less warmth in the west, it looked like, or at least moving into more the Montana area. So not many people there, so didn't see a reason to increase it based on that. And despite there being a little bit of a short-term change in the PNA, it's going negative for the first time in quite a while, I think. It looks like it wants to head back to positive by the time the forecast period comes along. So didn't make any changes based on the teleconnections. They all seem to be maintaining the same general pattern they've been maintaining for most of the summer. So with that being said, finished with a value of 59.7 with a spread of 8.9. Any comments, complaints, questions, or concerns?
I just noticed when I had so the most recent ECMWF, I guess it resets here. So it does have a look of just like you mentioned, Montana is warm. This is also, aside from the cool in South Dakota, this is pretty close to what the CPC has.
Even down to the northeast warmth and just a
Right.
small corner in the
It doesn't quite
northeast.
have, the cold along the Gulf Coast, but it certainly has it kind of blear eyes, has that same pattern, warm in northwest, and then the further southeast you go, it gets colder. I do remember the CPC discussion. They talked about it seemed like the ECMWF was really going strong with the soil moisture feedback. And we actually see that, cold in Missouri and such. And CPC thought maybe they're overdoing some of that soil moisture feedback a little bit in the European forecast.
Seems like our forecasts have been very similar, Stephen, for a few weeks, but I'm just riding the old adage that you play the hot hand while it's hot, or in this case, the cool hand while it's still hot. And persistence seems to be working good with this pattern.
So looking at, yeah. So you were also on the cold side, cooler side, as was I. So that makes sense. Did you want to discuss any more about some of these other percentages that went into your forecast?
No, we just, it's the same formula we've been using, but again, given what we've seen the last few weeks, it's difficult to stray from too far from climatology. We've been shading to the cool side of it for a few weeks. Mm-hmm. And, as long as that pattern's holding, we're going to kind of bias that way. So.
All right. Who would like to go next?
Hey, Dr. Decker, I had just a more broad question first, if I may, just to what Dr. Lupo was talking about and what a couple of folks were talking about earlier, just about the persistence. I guess when I was putting together my forecast, what's flustered me is there's some persistence now, but not really persistence from June, right? So in June we finished with, I think, according to the the Maxar CDD population weighted CDD numbers, I think it finished as the top year since 1950 by a couple CDDs. So record hot June, and now I just pulled up on their Dynacast page. What the most recent estimate for projection for July is, and their July 1st to July 31st estimate based on the data that we have as of today is for July to finish, I think, just a shade above the 30-year normal, or shade like warmer than the 30-year normal and a little bit cooler than the 10-year normal, or quite a bit cooler. And I guess so that's a comment, but I guess my question is for folks, and maybe in particular Dave D'Arcangelo too. I was going back and looking at some of the forecasts, July forecasts coming out of when we were back around June 20th, June 25th, and I think I was seeing a lot of market forecasts that were expecting a very hot July. I think I even saw some that were suggesting that July, could be another record month or very close. Like I saw one forecast for 410 CDDs, and again, the estimate right now I think is for the projection from Maxar is like 354, something like that. So I guess my question is, I guess a couple questions there. Like, were there, and this is for a few different folks, but for Dave, I guess, were there any market forecasts who that you witnessed that correctly saw? And let's assume it verifies, right? Because we're still in the first half of the month, but let's assume this plays out the way Maxar is showing. Were there any, vendor forecasts out there, or just forecasts in general, that saw this transition from a record hot June to a largely normal July? And I guess my second question, more broadly for everyone, is like, what's changed, right? Like, what's changed to fundamentally, whether it's the atmospheric drivers, teleconnections, MJO, ENSO, soil moisture, that's facilitated this transition.
Doesn't have, Dave, it doesn't have to change, because remember that July means tend to be warmer. So if you take a warm June that persists into July, what's warm for June may be close to normal for July.
I'm seeing here the pattern doesn't seem to have changed too much, but the
Yeah,
amplitude
Right. That's
has changed,
what I'm getting at. The amplitude.
especially the area of cold along the sort of south central US, but even along the East Coast, where it's pretty close to, if you average this out, it's close to 0.
Mhm.
And back in June, it was kind of this very uniform, slightly warm.
Well, and Dr. Decker, while you're doing that and while other folks are waiting to jump in, if you could also pull up, like I was looking at this at the 500 millibar level, like from a global view. I know I said, okay, let's look at June, and then let's look at what we have so far in July. And I'll just, while Dr. Decker's pulling it up, what caught my eye, just subjectively, was it also didn't look that different from at least a North America pattern, with the exception that, like in June, the trough was over Canada, and we didn't really get, it didn't really drop into the, there was that weakness, but not enough. But in the first half of July, it actually pinched off. It cut off, or was able to drop down into the United States. But the Western North America pattern doesn't look all that different.
What did I do wrong? I guess July 13th, there's no data yet. Is that what I'm doing wrong?
Yeah.
Today's the 13th.
There we go.
Yep.
Oh yeah. A little bit, but not a strong change.
So I'll wait. I'll jump in on this. Persistence is I agree, it's a very compelling forecast in mid-July, particularly when the June to July transition was just what was hot the first 2 weeks in June is no longer hot in mid-July.
Yep.
And I think compelling, it's always feels compelling mid-season to me, winter or summer, that persistence remains the best forecast. And it's always funny, it does until it doesn't. And there's an interesting thing that I think we've had a nice transition in the tropics. I don't know if I can share this, but we've had an interesting transition where the low frequency signal of the MJO was persistently over Africa and the West Atlantic, the Eastern Atlantic for the month of June. And around the 1st of July, that transition, and we saw a flare or a repositioning of the MJO towards the Indonesian subcontinent, which is typically more favorable for at least some potential for Eastern troughing. That looks like it sticks for another week or so, but there's some concern. There it is. What are we seeing here? Let me look. That's the initialization.
This is this is starting now and going.
So you're seeing this like coherent signal from Western Indonesia and the Eastern Indian Ocean to traverse and go into the Western Pacific. You should see a few typhoons kick off in the West Pacific out of that. But the question is that how coherent will that signal remain? If it remains coherent, it likely keeps a trough in the east, and I think these cool forecasts will verify, and that's fairly compelling. But I think there's some evidence to suggest, like the Euro ensembles this morning, and I think yesterday as well, they've suggested that the MJO is going to weaken after about the next 7 or 8 days, and we break it into 2 phases. One kind of flaring across the Eastern Pacific. We should get a few hurricanes in the East Pac out of this after around the 23rd, 24th, and then another component of it kind of flaring in the West Indian Ocean. And in my view, if that were to occur, it opens the door to get another another protrusion of the Montana Dakotas ridge, which has been so persistent. We get a potential for that to protrude east, which it has at times. We've seen some very strong heat northeast first half of summer. We're probably above normal number of 90-degree days from, like, say, the mid-Atlantic north to New England, despite the verification broadly not looking all that impressive. So if the MJO does not behave in a coherent fashion, I think MJO forecasts, particularly in summer, past, say, day 10, are very suspect. But if it does not remain coherent in the West Pac, then I think that we open the door, despite higher than average soil moisture anomalies. And maybe what we open the door for is we just open the door for, like, absolutely disgusting levels of high dew points. That's when you're going to get your 80-degree dew point to places like Indianapolis. But you may set up the possibility that you get this above normal anomaly to again bleed across the northern half of the country. Now, Texas is probably hopeless, or feels pretty hopeless at this point. But I guess what I'm saying here is I'm trying to justify. I nudged my forecast a little warmer. I'm on the warm side, I think, of distributions, and for the main reason that I don't have faith that this MJO signal, which has been pretty compelling the first half of July and probably remains compelling another 7 or 10 days. I don't have a lot of faith that that's going to continue into the first or the last few days of July or the first week in August, and we just at least open the possibility. This is where I think that what we try to do here is we try to, rather than frame this in terms of like an absolute number, and I understand for the purposes of the contest, that's the way we play it. But really, we like to look at kind of what are the possibilities of the distributions of outcomes. What we're seeing is the chance that we get another burst of heat. But again, as I go back to what I said at the beginning, in mid-season, particularly in summer, when you've been this wet and cool in the middle third of the country, persistence is pretty compelling.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like maybe if you had full control over your forecast, you might do a bimodal distribution, right? We're forced to do a bell-shaped curve here, basically.
Yeah, I would actually. I think there's a fairly sizable possibility that these forecasts in like the low to mid 50s verify. It's not like if you drew a bell curve around my number, you might say, oh, that's a low chance. Maybe it's like a 10 or 15% chance. And I think it's sizable. It's like a 30 or 40% or more chance that you're down in that mid 50s range. But yeah, it would probably look a little bit more bimodal. Mm-hmm. Just on the lack of faith in the MJO, particularly for week 3. And I think the arbiter of that may end up ultimately being the fate of these West Pac typhoons, and maybe one or two hurricanes in the Eastern Pacific. But I think the West Pac typhoons will kind of be subtle but alter the base state of the North Pacific a bit. That's kind of how that's the way you get the change in the northern half of the United States. And that just remains to be seen.
Right, the heat in the Pacific Northwest a few weeks ago, I think they traced it back to some recurving tropical system of some sort, then amplifying the jet.
Yep, and I think that was the first extension of that MJO signal coming out of, no longer parking itself over Africa. That was the extension into that kind of the Eastern Indian Ocean and Indonesia. It was like the first the first salvo of that. That repositioning of the active phase, the active part of the Kelvin wave.
Any other comments on tropical connections before I ask? I guess Philip, you're here, I think.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about your forecast?
Sure. All right. So I think since I use a lot of the same things that other people have mentioned already, so I'll just go through this really quickly. As was already shown, the tropical signal, we have our tropical convection that's active in Eastern Indian Ocean, which puts the MJO signal close to phase 3. And then we don't really have an ENSO signal right now. So overall, putting the tropical signal together, I mainly just used our MJO analog and put in a value, I believe, of 59.8. As was mentioned already, CPC has a warm north and a cool south, and I treated this as a slightly cool signal, assuming that the cool anomalies in the south will win out over the less populated areas in the north. And then as we saw with the teleconnections, I could not see a very clear signal from the teleconnections, so I didn't really adjust the value from the 30-year very much for that. And then looking at the models, as was already mentioned, we have this EC showing the warmth in the north and the cold anomalies towards the south, similar to what we see in the CPC forecast. And then finally, for my weightings, I note that the 30-year means have been doing better than the 10-year means. And I hypothesize that that's due to the change in the calculations as we start a new cycle. And with that, I adjusted my forecast weightings. And the other thing that I changed for my summer forecast that's different from my winter forecast is that I have a CFS +9 CDD, and that's weighted 15% based on the performance in the past few years. And that seems to still be doing good this year.
All right. Yeah, if we go to, I guess, this year's bias, right, for the CFS, it's in that 9-degree ballpark. So basically a bias corrected CFS.
And if you, incidentally, if you look at the most recent verification that we were talking about earlier, if you add 9 to the CFS forecast, that essentially fixes the number. And I believe that actually comes out very close to the verification.
Yep.
That's a good point. And just about that point Dr. Decker was making earlier about why the CFS score was so bad. It just, yeah, I mean, from a spatial perspective, I agree. I'm sure it'd get a better score, but from a CD, from a, you know, just sort of a looking at the errors there, I think it was off by about 10 or 11 CDDs. So it was near the higher end in terms of, like, for example, my forecast, which was also not good, I think I was off by 8 CDDs. So I think that's why, yeah, just like Philip was saying, I just think it just seems like, and we've seen this like a broken record. I think Nat Johnson last year did a study on this and showed, right, if you bias correct it by about 10, it was somewhere around 10 CDDs, it performed, you know, I think pretty close or maybe even better than the EC model.
That certainly seems to be playing out this year, for sure. All right, is there anything else? Have I missed anyone in terms of their forecasts? Industry seems to be in line with a slightly cool forecast as well. I didn't pull up their, I know sometimes we look at their report, but I didn't pull it up. So I'm not sure, you know, if it's the same reasons that we've been discussing or if they brought in something else.
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah.
did one more question if I could, since we have a couple more minutes. Dave, if you wouldn't mind, I'm not sure if you chimed in though on the market expectations, because I always think that's interesting. You know, going back, so let's say July 13th or whatever. So going back maybe like 3 weeks, were there forecasts out there? I know there were some hot forecasts, but I don't have the kind of view of the market that you do. Were there were the majority of forecasts, you know, for well above normal Julys, or were there some forecasts there that kind of projected something along the lines of what we're seeing here?
I did not see anything down in this like low 360s range. In fact, most people in June were edging, you know, as June verified hotter. Most forecasts were kind of edging towards the hotter side. I think if you were in the 370s, you probably were pushing into the 380s, and there were plenty of forecasts that were in the, like, I saw some like 390s. I didn't see any over 400, but you know, yes, we were kind of edging to the hotter side as the month progressed. Unfortunately, I went on vacation. Thankfully, I didn't have to endure this like brutally cold first half of July, because I was at the shore or the beach down in South Carolina, so it didn't matter to me. But I also saved myself some pain. You know, I was on the hotter side as well. We don't do an official monthly CDD total. It doesn't really have any bearing in terms of how like the market trades, so it doesn't have any relevance in sense. So, but we were, you know, we had forecasts that were, well, I forward forecasts that were leaning to the hotter side as well. That's been the right play for the most part in the summer for the last 6 or 7 years. You know, to get something that would verify near the 30-year would, you know, it's going to look fairly unusual if we end up being there. So I didn't see any, but I'm sure some people had it. You know, at least at least those that I think we're keying on the kind of the wet, how wet Texas was, we're kind of like, that was a pretty big headwind to getting very hot. And if you were kind of leaning towards hotter Midwest, you probably also get a number that you shaved off some, you correctly shaved off some CDDs as well. That was the right call. Looks like the right call at this point.
Okay, thank you. And just one other quick comment. I think there's been a lot of talk about the persistence, and I know I've looked at that too a little bit in terms of June, July, August, or maybe even just fine tuning it to mid-July through mid-August, like, core summer. I think that would be a really interesting exercise. Again, if someone has time to look at that from even just a statistical standpoint to see how well that holds up. I don't know. I guess, and you maybe sense in my voice, I'm a little dubious here. Like, and my thoughts are probably worth what you paid for them. But if I had to put together a number for August right now, and it's going, am I going to put more weight on the last couple of weeks, which I guess would mean, hey, I'm going to go for kind of a normal August, versus am I going to look more toward what happened in June? I don't feel comfortable in persistence that what we're seeing the last couple of weeks or the next week necessarily is a good arbiter for August. I would lean more toward hot tenure or above. Again, my thoughts are worth what you paid for them, but I feel like persistence is a little bit. It's like what persistence are you weighting it? Again, are you weighting persistence from a monthly? Then you're hot. From a week. Or something like that. So I think even the anchor points on that are somewhat dubious without a little bit further sort of investigation.
I concur, Dave. I think it's a challenge to kind of keep weighing, leaning on persistence. Like I said, I think a few minutes ago, it works until it doesn't. I would love to have recorded our conversation around the second week in January, when persistence would have kind of just had us a very mild ending to winter, and a month later we're 5 below zero in Dallas. So
Dave, I got news for you. It was recorded.
I don't want to go. I don't want to go listen to it. I've been. No, I don't have any desire to go back and revisit that.
So maybe we can end with a little preview for next week. Here's the current Maxar forecast for how things will shake out for our next verification period. We have a very similar pattern to what we've been seeing recently. What's the actual number here? It is down in between the 10 and 30-year normals at 58.5 is the current estimate. So if we look at the forecasts, where did it go? This one. Here was down. I guess I said 58.5. So it looks like a number of folks are very warm, and it's going to, unless, that still could change, but for targeting even a few humans were colder than that. But it looks like we'll be back similar to the last few weeks, close to normal, even if slightly above normal, but not nearly as above normal as many of our forecasts were for the next period. So that'll be interesting to look into next week as well.
I'm going to put a bag over my head next week.
Same, Dave, same.
I do have a question, but I guess this is probably a question for next week since we're out of time. But how much of the improvement in the 30-year score and the poor performance of the 10-year score is due to the update from 81 to 10 to 91 to 20 and the 10-year normal to the 11 to 20?
It'd be interesting to, if we had additional, the older 30 and 10-year normals on here as well, how would they compare? I assume, I don't know about the summertime, but I assume, in general, these normals should be warmer than they were, a year ago, since the last decade on average for most areas and most seasons would be warmer than the 80s. But I don't know how much of a difference, how much that's changed. That'd be interesting.
To be continued.
All right, well, we're out of time. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I don't know if Dave, you had any final words before we end today's meeting?
No, this is great. Thank you so much, Dr. Decker.
All right, no problem.
Thanks, Dr. Decker. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
See everyone next week.
Guys, thank you.
Bye, guys.